From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm DonnFelker.
And I'm KaushikGopal.
Welcome to the show. This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by BuddyBuild. BuddyBuild is a mobile-optimized continuous integration and delivery platform that takes minutes to set up. Thousands of mobile development teams love BuddyBuild because it's the fastest way to build, test, distribute, and gather feedback on their apps. With every git push, BuddyBuild will kick off a new build, run your UI tests in parallel on real devices, and automatically deploy your build to your users via Slack or email. With a simple screenshot, testers can send their feedback directly to you along with important diagnostic details. And if your app ever crashes, BuddyBuild will record the frequency, affected users, and traces back to the exact lines of source code that caused the crash in the first place. BuddyBuild gives development teams like yours perfect insight into bugs and empowers you to iterate on your app faster than ever, knowing that you're building an app that your users will love. Join thousands of developers who've already added BuddyBuild to their development process. Try it free today at fragmentedpodcast.com/BuddyBuild. So Kaushik, what have you been up to today? You been pretty busy or no?
Android developer, always busy, man. You got to keep yourself busy. So much to do.
There's like not enough time in the day. I got like 80,000 things to do on my checklist, and I think I got half of one done today.
That pretty much sums up the amount that I got done as well. There's so many of these videos. There are these great conference videos that I have queued up and that I need to watch. So much to do, so little time.
Speaking of those videos, I still have one saved from the AndroidDev Summit last year that I still have not watched.
Oh, wow, really?
They're like the ones that oh, I really need to watch this. This looks cool. I think I can get something out of it, but it's not really pertinent to what I'm doing at the time. So I just kind of add it to the watch later list.
Oh, for sure. I have a whole bunch of those as well. Like, they were like advanced constraint layouts, or like, one of these views that I always want to know more about because I feel like, that would be useful for the next project. But you got to make the time, I guess.
Exactly. Well, anyway, so what do you think we were going to talk about today? What should we talk about?
So there's this topic that has plagued both of us for quite some time. And it's a topic that we've been pushing out because we both are pretty passionate about this topic. And it's also a topic that I think that is like widely discussed in the Android development community. And people keep asking you this question. People keep asking me this question. And we keep saying, it's hard to respond to that in 140 characters, but we have strong opinions. So today is finally that day where we get to pour our hearts over this topic, and that's about the use of EventBus today. What do you think?
I completely agree. And to be 100% honest and forthcoming about the topics of EventBuses, for many years, dating all the way back to around 2008, probably even before that, when I was first introduced to them, it's been a huge tool in my tool chest, and I have literally used the living heck out of EventBuses to the point of its detriment, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I still to this day think, and I still need them from time to time. And what I've found is I'll sometimes lean on either a custom library, or I will kind of write my own little one if I don't need a big library, which we'll get into again as well. Now, that's me. What about you? Do you feel as passionate about EventBuses as I do, or have you changed, or what's your thoughts?
It's funny you would mention, I felt the exact same way when I discovered the use of an EventBus. I'm like, my life has changed from this moment on, and I kept using EventBuses all over the place. And it was useful, and to a large extent, it has helped me in many ways, right? For example, there are certain use cases when you want to communicate between fragments, when, fragments were a thing. Like EventBuses are extremely useful, and they were, I felt at that point of time, the right tool for the job. But also, like you mentioned, it has come to a point where I feel EventBuses today are being overused to the point of it being mildly abused. And that leads to certain problems that we'll start to touch upon. But my feelings are exactly the same.
Let's I think rewind a little bit too before we dive into what we think and choices and troubles and pluses and minuses, and talk about exactly what an EventBus is. And I'll take a stab at it here, and you can augment or help me out here as we go along.
Yeah.
So now an EventBus, if you take a particular concept like a layered architecture of your application. And what I mean by layered architecture, this kind of follows a lot of stuff that we talk about with Martin Fowler, which Kaush and I are both big fans of. You have various different layers of your application. At the root layer, which is sometimes your data layer, that's sometimes called a repository. On top of that, you may have what's known as a service layer or the business logic layer. And then at the top layer sometimes is the UI layer. And this is the typical, very simple, naive, 3-layered architecture that you've seen probably in many enterprises or applications around. And if you haven't, this is usually where you kind of go when you first start wanting to separate your application into different logical layers. Now, the problems end up starting to come up when you need to have something happens down at a lower layer or at a higher layer, and you need to propagate that event, whatever it is, to maybe from the database up to the UI. Now, if something like that were to happen, you have to basically pass that from the database, the repository, up to the business logic or service layer, and then all the way up to the UI layer. And then if you need to get that back down there, it has to traverse this entire path again. And this even complicates itself a lot more if you start introducing other layers of your application that do various other things as well. You get 5, 6, 7 different layers, depending upon what feature or screen you're working in. Long story short, you have a bunch of coupling inside of your application, and it's hard to pass messages around. And so an EventBus, so if you think of a layered architecture sitting in a vertical, like horizontal lines stacked on top of each other, you would think of a EventBus as a component that sits vertically next to them. So it actually sits directly next to them and talks to each one of the layers independently and allows you to decouple your application. And if we really want to think about it in a very simple way, it's actually just an implementation of the pub sub pattern, meaning that any particular layer can say, hey, something happened, this customer was updated. You can then publish that event, and anyone who wants to know about that customer has been updated can then say, hey, anytime a customer updated event is fired, just go ahead and let me know so I can do something with it. And this could be one place in your application, because I'm sure this has happened with a lot of people. You have a particular widget on the screen that's in one fragment that needs to get updated, but then you also have another fragment that's visible, maybe like a master detail view. Customer gets updated, you need to update both locations. What ends up happening at that time, if you're in a traditional approach, you have to update both screens, and you have a bunch of glue and plumbing code you got to write that's very fragile, brittle, error prone. But if you introduce an EventBus, you can kind of decouple that because of that pub sub pattern. Now, that's kind of how I've usually explained it to folks. I've even written a blog post on this way back in 2009 when I was doing a lot of stuff with .NET using some of WPF's event aggregator code. So really way throwback, and I actually started working with that way back in 2005 and 6. So I have some history with it there.
I love this.
What about you? What are your thoughts on it?
My thoughts on your blog post are amazing. I love the fact that like this .NET post exists. Like DonnFelker, who I know is like an author of Android books, has written this .NET blog post that warms my heart a little.
Yeah, the funny thing is most people have no idea about me, but my roots were in the Microsoft stack, and I cut my teeth there very early on.
I still maintain, I think C# is like a great language, and .NET is like, it's a great language. Coming back to like your original question, I think you summarized it perfectly well. Much like you, I also had like a post where I wrote about like the EventBus, and essentially, I tried to talk about like how you could use RxJava for like this EventBus. We'll add a link to that in the show notes as well.
What about, are there any libraries that you know of that most folks have looked at using to help facilitate implementing an EventBus with a proper EventBus library?
Absolutely. So even to this day, if people want to use an EventBus, I usually recommend Square's Otto, OTTO. For those who don't know why it's labeled Otto, Square has like these cute stories for the names of their projects.
Why is it?
So it's basically a Simpson reference. For folks who have seen The Simpsons.
Otto!
The name of the bus driver is Otto. So
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that was like a nice tidbit that I picked up along the way. So usually I recommend Otto. There is the constant question these days, because for folks who go and see Otto, I believe Square has said that they're not actively maintaining it?
Yeah, if you actually go to, I mean, I haven't heard that statement from any of the folks that we know at Square. But if you actually go to the GitHub page, so github.com/square/Otto, you'll actually see a large deprecated warning on the library now.
Oh, really? Interesting.
And this is funny. This kind of ties back because if you read it, it says this project is deprecated in favor of RxJava and RxAndroid, which we'll talk about in a second. Yada, yada, yada. If you're looking for guidance on migrating from Otto to Rx, this post is a good start. And this post that they link to is actually your blog post that you were just talking about.
Our mutual good friend, Jesse Wilson, was the one who, I believe, pointed someone towards that. Yeah, so I remember, and I want to ask you, like, if you had like a similar sort of story in the beginning. So there were two that were like pretty big. One is Otto. The other was by this company called greenrobot. And I think it was just called EventBus, E and B being capital, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yep.
And for the longest time, there was like always like the discussion of like which was better, because like Otto was a very, like in typical Square fashion, was a very simple implementation. They made it as simple as possible. Even the details were like implemented in a way which was very easy to understand. So you could just plop the source code open even today, and you would pretty much very easily understand how the whole thing is implemented. greenrobot went the other route, and they added a lot of functionality where you could cache stuff in your EventBus. There were like some other things that I don't recall specifically, but there were like certain functionality that I believe EventBus had that Otto didn't, but it was like one of those like few edge cases that you would need. Typically, I stuck like to Otto just because like, I trust Square to know like what they're doing.
Yeah.
But the use of like EventBus promoted certain functionality which wasn't necessarily, which led to like bad code, right?
Yeah.
So that was also like one reason I remember where I felt, no, actually, in that case, it might be better to just stick with Otto. So did you also start along the same route?
Yeah. When I was first looking for a few versions, I actually wrote one of my own initially that I used internally. It was very embarrassing code, to tell you the truth. It was based upon, my interactions with my previous life as a .NET developer. But at around that same time, Otto kind of came on to the scene, and I was drawn to it immediately as well. And then I also learned about greenrobot's EventBus. And furthermore, there was a long-running, almost kind of weird tension between the Otto community and the greenrobot EventBus community based upon saying, who's faster, which one is better, why you should use this one over this one. And it always seemed that kind of people had their religious wars over it. At the end of the day, though, I was in the same fence as you. It makes sense to use something that's just simple and works. And Otto was one of those things. It was a couple of lines of code. I didn't have to think too hard about it, and it solved my problem, and I was able to move on to the next business problem.
Makes perfect sense.
What are some of the things that you used EventBuses for during your tenure with them?
Great question. One place where I found EventBuses to be extremely useful was in the days of fragments, right?
You don't use fragments anymore?
I don't actually anymore. Well, that's...
Okay, we'll open that can of worms another episode.
That war for another episode. When we, like in certain places where we do use fragments, in order to communicate between fragments, like an EventBus is just the easy way to go, right? Versus passing that event up to the parent activity and then making sure that activity passes it back to other activities. It was a big pain, and this is like the prime example where like Otto shines, right? Like you can have it, and not just between fragments. And even to this day, I think like it's a very good use case for an EventBus. If you wanted to communicate between an activity and say a service, right?
Yes.
To this day, I don't you can use other alternatives, and we can talk about this as well. You can use like a broadcast receiver. There's like the other thing, what's it called? Local
service connections and binders and all that kind of stuff too, which gets hardcore.
Right. At which point I'm like, there's like, that's way too much code. Like, an EventBus is so simple, and it gets like, using Dagger, I just inject my EventBus into like the service. I inject it into the activity, and I push from one place, I subscribe in the other place, boom, you're done, right? So even to this day, I think like it works pretty well. Like I would prefer going the EventBus route versus like, using service binders and all that kind of stuff. What are some places that you think you found using an EventBus as being useful?
I found a lot of the use cases to be very similar to your use cases. And The first one being the activity to fragment communication, inter-fragment communication. So I had multiple fragments on the screen. Also the service one, which was very common, and I still, that's always my first thought when I am building something and I need to communicate with a service that's running in the same process, which is an important note, that I will use an EventBus to do that, just because it made it so much easier to do. That's been the majority of everything I've done. Now, it's also been used at a couple of companies that I've been at to communicate system-wide events, like, hey, there is a system sync and process. We're syncing data for the entire app. Let's pause something. Let's let the user know. Let's not allow new transactions to be saved. Or, hey, we are now in a disconnected state. Network connectivity is gone, and we want to post that for some reason. So there's various different places I've used it, and it's always come to mind anytime I need multiple subscribers to need to know about an event. That's always come to mind. But I have been leaning on other options. Have there been any other places that you've used it at all, or is that kind of been your main area?
Two other areas that I found that it was pretty useful was one with GCM notifications. So that's one thing that I used at Wedding Party, and I found even to this day, I found that to be a really good implementation where internal push notifications. So for those who understand how the push notification system works in Android, you get the push notification from outside using a receiver.
Yep.
And in order to you either push you either pop the notification if your app is backgrounded, or you have an internal sort of update on the screen, and that would depend on how your application treats that event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you don't necessarily know which activity is currently in the foreground, right? So that's pretty tricky to do. So instead, what you would do is you would just publish this through your EventBus, and then on every activity that's concerned with this, it would just listen to that event and then accordingly update, right? So that's with GCM notifications, and we can add a link to a blog post where they talk about how you can implement GCM notifications using an EventBus. That was super useful.
In those situations, did you find yourself using a superclass of some sort to subscribe to these events so you didn't implement the same logic in multiple places?
That's a good question. Yeah, typically I would do that. And there are certain quirks. For example, I think this was one of the things that was a difference between Otto and probably EventBus, from greenrobot, was I think if you subscribe in super classes, that is abstract classes or parent classes, it doesn't work. It has to be at the child class, or there was some variant. I don't even remember what it is, but there was a workaround to that, right? So if you had a base class, which is very typical for most standard applications, right? So you had a base activity and you wanted to subscribe in that base activity to an event. For example, push notifications are a great example, right? You want, or the example that you mentioned about syncing, in all likelihood, any activity that you have would want to know of those events. And you can't do that in a base activity because typically you would think that your base activity is abstract or something. So that didn't work out of the box. There is a workaround where you register that as an explicit observer. But yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Have you used it recently? Have you used an EventBus for anything recent? Because I had a very recent use case where I thought, you know what, it might just make sense to use an EventBus.
To be 100% honest, I have found uses for it, but it's the weird thing with being an Android developer and being in a very active community, especially one that's very passionate about RX. I feel almost dirty for thinking about an EventBus.
Yeah,
so
that is the feeling.
I can use an EventBus to solve this problem, but then immediately I'm like, oh, it's deprecated. I can't use that anymore. I can go use EventBus from greenrobot, of course, but for some reason, I'm thinking, okay, well, now maybe I need to progress. And then I end up finding myself reading your blog post for the 18th time. I'm like, okay, maybe I should event one this way. So the long version of saying, no, I haven't used it. What about you?
I actually very recently I used it, and I had the exact same thought process as you, but I convinced myself that it made sense to actually just use an EventBus. So the example was, so I had this activity, right? As both you and I both of us are we believe in the view model and the presenter pattern. So I have an activity presenter. This activity has an adapter. The adapter has a presenter, right? So there's an adapter presenter, and the adapter in turn has a view holder. So the view holder has a presenter, right? And these are like cases where it made sense for me to have presenters because there was a lot of like funky stuff happening in that view. So which is why I used the presenter. It goes back to the original explanation that you gave, which I really enjoyed that explanation, by the way. Like the coupling that happens. So all the way from the activity to the view holder. Like in the view holder, that's where you have access to like, your button or like your text view or something that needs to have like a click listener or of sort.
There's a lot of layers there to get there. You know, if you look at your code, like you're newing up an instance of this adapter and you're setting in this equal to that and then a view holder and like all this kind of stuff going on.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want to communicate backways the right way, Martin Fowler says we have to like use this intermediate view. You can't just like get a reference directly to the parent class, right? So you have like this view in between. And I found myself that in order to communicate all the way from the view holder to the activity, because the activity is what would kick off, like, like this, that's where you have like, that was the right logical place to take this action because you're launching another screen. So I want to do that in the activity, not at the view holder, right? So when I did that, I was like, wow, in order to pass this event all the way up, I had like 4 channels. Like, I had to like implement interfaces. And in those interfaces, I had to have like a callback. And I was like, this is exactly why he had like the EventBus, right? Like the whole point was to avoid like this sort of nested. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to use an EventBus. And sure enough, like what otherwise would have been like 20 lines of code spread across like the whole, like across like 5 class files, it just got done in 2 class files. Like, the point where I'm like shooting the event out, which is the view holder, and the point where I was interested in listening, which is the activity. So that was like a very recent case, because how else would I approach it? Yeah, sure, I could use like the interface pattern, but that seems like a pain in the behind, right?
Yeah, it does. And you bring up a very valid point. Is like this is like one of the right times to use it because it's allowing you that decoupling, and so you don't overload. It's kind of keeping it the KISS principle, keeping it simple.
Right.
And in this case, it is sort of simplifying it because if you take it a step further, now let's say you click on that button and you need to pass an event or whatever up to the activity. So you got those 4 layers of indirection to get there. And then for some reason, you determine, or the activity or whatever type of code determines something needs to happen back down to that view and that view holder. Maybe it needs to flip or spin or turn red. Now you have to go back, traverse those other 4 layers again to change that in the opposite direction. So that's even more code. But if you're using an event bus, like, okay, maybe it's just another event and that's it.
Yeah.
But, I think that kind of leads us, this is kind of the situation where you're like, you first see event buses working. It's almost that same type of scenario, the master detail views, and you need to update multiple things at once. And you get that feeling of like this God feeling of this is magical. I love this. I will never code with that one again. And then you start to get into trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess now we should talk about like some of the problems with an event bus, right? Like what are the problems exactly we talked about like what it is, some of the great use cases. What are like some of the biggest problems that you've had with an event bus? It's like you said, it's like, it's so magical. Like it's like chocolate, right? Like chocolate is amazing, but too much chocolate for you at some point is going to make you sick.
You're right. Yeah.
So that's like pretty much how I felt. What are your qualms with an event bus?
What I've found over time, and we use the event bus a lot. I'll keep the client names out of this, but we have used them a few of my clients.
Right.
And all of us as developers eventually got to the point of like event fatigue, meaning that
I love that term.
we had to just how we feel that no freaking clue who was firing what event, where it was coming from, how it was happening. We'd have multiple places firing that same event. So when you think you found the location of where it was fired and you'd make a change, like it didn't affect it. And we found that it made it so easy to make changes that it actually made the code a lot harder to read. And that was probably my biggest complaint. It also made it, in the end, quite brittle because we had so many events being fired off. Have you ever run into a situation like that?
That is exactly how I feel. Like, you plucked the words from my mouth. That's exactly what I felt. Because everyone's like, this is amazing. And then like the next thing you know, like I have 4 events like firing off. We add logs and like, because like there's some bug, like something happens when it's not supposed to happen. Like, the background, like, a fragment changes position or like something happens. And then we have people saying like this doesn't work the way it is, and like you have no idea because, well, you look at the activity and it's like, yeah, I can see that would happen because the event fired, but like where does the event get fired? Oh, like it gets fired from 4 places. Which 4 of those places like did it actually fire from? I have no clue because like, that basically means you have to like traverse and
did it get fired after this other event got fired that altered this view? Because now it alters the view too, but if it get altered in a different way because a GCM notification came in, then we're not sure if it should be red or blue. Do you see what I'm saying?
This is where a perfect example where the decoupling sort of like bites you in the behind because you're like, I have no clue. And so in order to reproduce this bug, I have to try all 4 scenarios, right? And like you said, if that in turn was fired by another event, then you have to see like the other 10 places that this got fired from. And the next thing you know, you're like, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever.
And you have this humongous puzzle in your head, like this humongous gear, this humongous engine of gears like going in your head. You finally understand everything. You're like, okay, I think I can figure it out now. You're starting to wrap your head around it. And then all of a sudden someone comes over and says, hey, you got a few minutes to talk? And like just destroys you completely. And you're just like, yeah, sure. And then you're going to spend the next 30 minutes, getting back into the flow just because you went crazy with the events. And you said earlier, you said, 4 events. I remember at one point that I think I had counted over 60 different event classes that we had in one of our apps. And it was just nuts, like just craziness.
Right. And you brought up, like you mentioned this, and I think this is like where this is the crux of like, I guess, the problem that both of us have, right? It's that the readability of the code starts to become a problem, and the cognitive load, right?
Cognitive, totally.
Like you said, like there's this like complex graph that you have to maintain in your head of like how these events communicate, and at that point is where productivity like really sort of like sinks, right? Like that's when like the cannonball has like blasted through like the hull of your ship, and like you're sinking because like nothing makes any sense anymore.
It's a complete chaos. It's like the bus turns into the application almost.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Now,
right.
and I also ran into, there's other problems too that you run into, like especially when we were first starting to use Otto, and that one is that Otto by default is thread confined to the main thread.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And so there was a big thing about, well, how do we do cross-thread communication? I need to access this from a intent service that I need to communicate with, and I need to send messages back and forth, or even another service that fires a background thread off. How do I do that? You had to create your own bus that used the main looper, and and then you checked if it wasn't, then you'd post it, whatever, back and forth, and that was difficult. So you had to maintain that as well.
That makes sense. So, okay, I guess at this point we have also like voiced our like concerns with an EventBus, and it's clear at this point that you and I would probably not use an EventBus if we had a better alternative, right?
Yeah.
So what are the alternatives? Like, if not an EventBus, what do I use?
Well, there's a few things that are out there right now, and I'm just talk about a couple of them. And the first one that I think about, and because I had a lot of experience with this, is in building an SDK, is actually using, if let's say we're building services, right? Actually Android services, and they're going to be running in a different process. Using an event bus actually really won't work there because it's in a completely different process. So you actually need to actually start relying on AIDL. Now, I probably just struck fear into like 90% of the Android developers by saying those words.
Yeah.
So luckily, most people don't have to interact with AIDL that much, so that's good. So let's just go ahead and scratch that one off the list. The other ones that we have here is broadcast receiver. And so you can actually post a broadcast, and then you can then have a receiver that gets called in your application when this type of thing is fired off. And this was basically the way to do it before Otto and all these other ones came out. And it was even like the local broadcast manager and the local broadcast receiver, which would then keep those events and messages local to your application as well.
Right.
But it's also not type safe. These types of receivers are not type safe. You're basically shoving data into intents, which we've all dealt with intents long enough to know that we have all these various keys and encodings, and
it has to be parselable. If it's not parselable, you have like all those other problems. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so you can run into all the types of issues there. So those are kind of the common options. Though I know that you're passionate about another option. And what would that be?
So that's I was going to ask this similar question is like, okay, let's forget all this baggage and history that we have. If you were starting today, I still would like to use an event bus in certain places. So what would I use, right? And my sort of preference is like usually typically with RxJava, like if there's like an RxJava alternative, I usually tend to use that. And so it's actually with RxJava, and this is also why it suddenly started to like spur like many of these questions. Many people don't understand that RxJava and like people who are like sort of just getting into RxJava don't understand this. RxJava is not an alternative to an event bus. RxJava is this like massive sort of like pattern and this whole sort of new way of thinking that you subscribe to, which makes the implementation of some of these other things trivial, right? And this is like the blog post that I wrote about like the event bus that you were kind enough to reference. I basically implemented using RxJava a very simple like event bus. And this goes back to like how elegant the concept is of an event bus, right? It's so simple. Just with a subject, like a simple RxJava subject, like you can achieve like all the functionality of an event bus, right? You can, if you use a behavior subject, then you could have like the sticky event sort of like pattern that you wanted to use. If you wanted to like just have like, just like a regular event bus that just like passes things across, then you can use like a publish subject. So that's like a very, very typical pattern. I must add a caveat. There's a better alternative to using subjects. It's like specifically in the cases of event bus. Have you found yourself using RxJava like in this context, like as an event bus?
Yeah, I have. I actually took your example and kind of extended it to in an application within I think it was 2015 is the last time that I'd used that implementation. But now there's a couple of other options out there. Have you used Jake's Relay at all?
Yeah, exactly.
Looked into it?
Yeah, that's the thing that like I was trying to allude to as well. Jake's Relay is perfect for an event bus. And I actually recently updated that implementation that I had of my RxBus in the samples repository to use Jake's Relay, right? And we talked about this in the RxJava 2 episode that we recently had a chat with him about. The relay is essentially exactly the same as a subject, but as he mentioned, there isn't any termination event, right? And so this is almost perfect, especially in the cases of an event bus, because here's the problem that people didn't get when you used a subject as an event bus. The nature of the contract of RxJava is like if you have a terminal event, like for example, if you had an on error, which it could happen, like, something in the tool chain, like something in the chain just like through an exception or an error, your subject will just like terminate. So
it's done.
Yeah, it's done. Like, thank you very much. Like it's time to go home. Peace out. That's how like that's the contract that you adhere to with RxJava. So that can be problematic for an event bus because you want an event bus to keep going on. Like the future events need to be passed on, which is why if you substitute the subject literally with a relay, the APIs are like exactly the same. I'll try to post a link with the difference between like when I switched it to use Jake's Relay versus like a subject. It's literally just like making sure you have the imports right and then swapping the object. So that is
really,
it's super straightforward.
So is it also type safe too? I mean, like, because it's Rx.
I don't know if it's type safe in that it won't crash, but like you have like when you get the event, all you have to do is make sure that the event is of an instance that you care about, and if it is, then you just cast it into like that. And like obviously, if you checked it's an instance of that event, then you don't have any type issues, right? So you just use that object and then like treat it like as you would as any regular event bus.
Interesting. Okay.
There is one caveat though, and like this is what people initially brought up when people said, "Oh, can I just use like RxBus instead of like RxJava?" Like the experienced folks in RxJava were like, "Whoa, hold on a second. If you do RxJava correctly," and this is like the big caveat, you typically don't need an event bus. So for folks who are listening, if you notice, Donn said, "Hey, like the last time I used this was like in 2015," and that's exactly the reason why, because after that, like all the RxJava code, like if you understand RxJava well enough, as Donn does, then what would happen is you would use it in the correct fashion, which would obviate Did I pronounce that right? Yeah.
Pretty sure you did, yeah.
That would just obviate the need to even use an event bus. So if that's like a good rule of thumb. If you find yourself desperately in the need of an event bus in order to execute something with RxJava, when you have RxJava available, especially for like new code, like with legacy code, it makes sense, like where you might find yourself in these positions where you can't, you need to use an event bus. But if you're using RxJava the right way, you typically don't need an event bus at all, right? Which is why I like using the RxBus more. So for new greenfield projects, if I need the event bus, I have it just like, in the form of a subject that I keep on the side. But more often than not, just with the single import of RxJava, I've taken care of like all my needs in terms of like addressing both concerns, right?
Yeah, I think you bring a good point up there. And that's kind of what's popped into my head over the last year. And I've been working with Rx for a while now, like you. Rx is one of those things that when you think you know it, it comes back to smack you to tell you that you don't know it.
Right.
And it's very difficult in that regard to really wrap your head around all of the variations and things you can do. It's very easy to also get yourself into a dangerous situation with it. But that said, when you start writing applications that need to be decoupled and you need that functionality where you think you need that event bus, you can start looking at your app and say, all right, well, how can I maybe expose this stream of data in a way that multiple folks can subscribe to it? They are subscribers.
Exactly. Right.
And that's kind of when you start getting into more of your architecture of your application of like, okay, well, maybe I haven't architected my application well enough to enable it to be, maybe I'm not using Dagger and I am not using dependency injection correctly. And maybe I could then create these types of, something that is, emitting items, a stream of some sort that I need to have subscribers for in multiple places. And if I'm using something like Dagger and have architected something, somewhat well, I can then inject it to many places. And then those subscribers can subscribe and unsubscribe as they would like. And then at that point, I've kind of removed my need for an event bus in those given situations. Now, each one is going to be unique in itself. But when you start asking yourself a question of like, okay, how can I kind of make these streams available elsewhere, you kind of start thinking about the problem with a different frame of mind.
Exactly. There are way better, safer, more optimum ways to use RxJava where it would just like remove the need for you to even have an event bus.
And I think it's, I think it's kind of, we're nearing the end of our conversation about this here, but I think it's also important to loop back and say, we're not saying that an event bus is bad. Not at all. It has its use case, and you've even used it very recently to solve a particular problem, and I agreed with you, it was a great solution. So it does have its use case. There are just very common pitfalls that you need to be aware of when you're developing using an event bus. And there's also questions that you should ask yourself of like, is this the right tool for the job? And I think that's what we're really trying to talk about here is it the right tool for the job? If it is, okay, use it. Are we abusing it? Yes or no? And then is there an alternative for it? Am I already using RxJava? Is this something that we can use inside of our application by just maybe adding some architecture decisions or architecture changes to our app to enable these streams elsewhere? So it's just evaluating the tools for the job itself.
All right. So Donn, we have a couple of listeners who just suddenly woke up this instant, and I'm asking you the question. If you started a new greenfield project today, because this is like the question, like essentially that everyone wants the answer for, would you use an event bus?
Out of the box, no. When I approach a new project, there are a few libraries, and this actually goes back to like our IO special, like what libraries do you start with, right? Like literally mine are Dagger, can't live without it. RxJava is another one I can't live without. And then from there, it kind of goes all over the place depending upon what the project's going to be out. If it's HTTP based, I need to, of course, retrofit. And if it's, I'm doing something else with, audio, then I need some audio library, whatever. But I would not use an event bus out of the gate. It's only when I get to the point where I think, or I'm in a situation like you were before of like, wow, I'm going to add all kinds of layers on my application at this point, or all kinds of layers of indirection here. This looks messy. Maybe I should use a bus here. And that's when I'll pull it in. What about you?
Dagger and RxJava would be my it's funny, like in all the IO episodes, we always ask other people, we never necessarily like pointed out what the libraries that we would use were.
I know.
And I'll still keep the suspense, but two of those libraries are exactly the same as Donn in that any project that typically I start, I plop in RxJava and Dagger. Like those two, like just my experience has taught me that I write better code having those in my arsenal. So I just have those.
Mm-hmm.
And so because I have RxJava, 98 to 99% of the time, I try not to use an EventBus at all. But if I do find myself like, I really, really need to use an EventBus at this point, then I'll just like use an RxBus, because since I already have RxJava imported, I can just like in a few lines of code, like create my own EventBus and then use that. It comes with that big caveat. Yeah, so that's the thing. I feel like that's my usage of an EventBus. Now, for folks who are actually like interested in using an EventBus, because again, an EventBus, for those who have used it, understand clearly like how it is, what it's used, what's involved.
Uh-huh.
For those who are interested in learning more, I want to point people to like my standard go-to resource that I have at this point, which is the first thing I do is I open up caster.io. You do have a video on EventBus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Annyce actually does this series on the EventBus.
I'll make sure to add like show note links to both of those episodes. So if folks are interested in learning in EventBus, I would highly recommend that video.
Definitely, yeah. And we cover subjects and Dagger and all that kind of good old stuff too. So,
yep. All right. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by DonnFelker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit all of the Fragmented episodes ourselves. The amazing Sarah from Spec helps us with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme music and ad music is produced by the cool cat, Alan Taylor. You can find more episodes of the show on Pocket Casts, Google Play Music, or any of the other great podcast players in town. Our website is fragmentedpodcast.com, and you can find the links to all the stuff we say on our website.
Once again, we'd like to thank our sponsor for today's episode, BuddyBuild. BuddyBuild is a mobile-optimized continuous integration and delivery platform that takes just a few minutes to set up. Join thousands of developers who've already added BuddyBuild to their development process. Try it free today. Go to fragmentedpodcast.com/BuddyBuild.
Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.
And that's a wrap.